All right. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Thursday night at the Beck Zoom. Nice to see all your faces. Just a reminder that next week we have the virtual Veil concert on October 1st with Aoife O'Donovan, and that is a different link. So don't come to this link next week. That's you have to go to Veil and get a ticket, which is free, to hear her concert. And if you'd like to join a Q&A with Aoife after the concert, that link will be coming around. And if you're here tonight, you're invited to the Q&A. It would be great if you could RSVP with me, just send me an email, or you can just show up. So I'm gonna hand the mic over to Maggie Messett, and she will introduce our event tonight. So thanks.
Thanks, Margot. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Mellon Fellow in Narrative Journalism. I'm in my second year and sad to not be on campus this year, but I'm zooming in from Pittsburgh, and I'm really excited to introduce and talk to tonight Garnette Cadogan. Born and raised in Jamaica, Garnette is a visiting fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, a visiting scholar at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, and the Harry W. Porter Jr. Distinguished Visiting Professor in Architecture, also at University of Virginia. He was the 2017-2018 Martin Luther King Jr. Visiting Scholar at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. As an essayist, Garnette's current research and writing explores the promise and perils of urban life, the vitality and inequality of cities, and the challenges of pluralism. In the fall of 2017, Freeman's Magazine included Garnette among a small group of writers around the world who represent the future of new writing. He's the editor-at-large of Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City atlas co-edited by Rebecca Solnit and Joshua Jelly Sapiro. And this evening, I'm really excited to talk to Garnette about walking. I also know that we've got two classes currently working on projects inspired by Garnette's essay, Walking While Black. So Garnette, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for that warm welcome. It sounds like I've been spending my life visiting, so it's good to sit down and be settled to have a conversation with you today.
So Garnette, I would love for you to kind of share with everyone, you're working, a lot of your work has been grounded in walking, but I know you're also working on a book on walking. So I'd love to have us start just by talking about that work that you're doing in particular and what drove you to use walking as a vehicle to bring us into other spaces.
First is the writer's habit of starting with the things that you love. So it's a way of trying to justify or to find a way to keep company with the things that you love very much and wanting an excuse to write about walking, this thing which gives me so much joy. It's a way of escape, it's a way of encounter, it's a way of arrival, it's the way in which more than any other, how I understand and encounter and understand the world. And I was looking for an excuse to write about this thing that brought me so much joy and that had such potent meaning in how I made my way through the world. But also, I was trying to find ways to write about these perennial topics which were tough to talk about but needed to be spoken about, and in which we ran the risk of either falling into cliche, namely race and racism in American cities, or we run the risk of speaking to the choir in which people nod and say, oh yes, I know that, and so in some ways that you're not being listened to, or those who disagree and will tune you out immediately. And again, this lack of engagement. And so I thought, why not choose something mundane, that we almost take for granted, short of an injury or frailty or disability, walking is this commonplace, mundane act for most of us. And I thought, but this mundane act is not so mundane for a lot of people. What if I turned in a microscope onto this and use it to see the ways in which looking at this thing that we take for granted that we often, would forget or, not even cross our minds in the midst of these tough conversations about, tough issues, and brought it in and to say, if the mundane is itself so complicated, it's such a minefield, if this thing that, we normally ignore, has a particular asymmetry to it, if that's like that, then, how much more so other areas, of life, how much more so, these conversations we're trying to have about institutions or conversations in all manner of spheres, whether it be education or healthcare or environmentalism or housing. If we could just put back and said, look at the simple mundane thing in it, how fraught it is. If it's like this, how much more so the other things where a lot more is at stake in terms of resources, in terms of power, in terms of advantages, at the expense of other people. And so I thought I would do that, and it also use it as a way to double up that, because if I'm an essayist, part of what an essayist really is somebody who tries to overstuff things when they're writing about it. You want the excuse to meander, the excuse to, take a break and, say, oh, look down that street. There's something interesting also down there. And yes, you can see the connection between this main street, but, just follow me, just trust me, and you'll find this interesting, and we'll get back on the main street and you'll see a connection somehow. So it became a way for me also to talk about movement and the joys, of movement, and, and how to think about questions of vulnerability and visibility, the ways in which, if you're Black, if you're a woman, if you're disabled, many other ways of being in the world, you're often given the option of being hyper visible, that you're too seen for all the wrong reasons, or you're invisible, you're not seen, not acknowledged, not recognized, or given recognition when you ought to be. And so it became a way to explore that also, to say I could take this side road and examine vulnerability, examine the question of, how do we see, how do we not see, what does it mean to actually truly see and acknowledge and recognize and encounter someone. And then it also became a chance to celebrate cities and move in cities, and to treat cities like a fossil record in which, just by way of walking at the body's pace at 3 miles an hour approximately, that's about the speed most of us walk, we could start peeling away these fossil records and seeing the contours and the ways in which they're delineating, and thereby, see the hidden cities. So one of the things that I was concerned about is our thirst for mastery, that whenever we speak of place, just about anything now, that there's this obsession with mastering it, with exhausting our knowledge of the place. And I wanted to say, what might it mean to take places that we often approach with an attitude of mastery, and ask, what might it mean to look at that place in focusing on the mystery rather than the mastery? So it became a way, walking, gave me the chance to operate at these multiple frequencies of, examining inequality, of looking at vulnerability, of talking about topics that, we needed to find new ways to enter the room, in a side door, with which to, be able to have a conversation. It became a way also to, find new ways to look at cities. And more than anything else, that what permeated all of these is that it became a way of seeing, what does it mean to actually truly see and be seen? And how could I write about it in a way that was new and it was fresh and that was inviting? And so walking seemed to present that opportunity.
I want to talk about the essay that you wrote inside Nonstop Metropolis. And I do want to share with everybody the map, because I think if people aren't as familiar with New York City, they don't really understand what this undertaking is. But before I do that, can you describe to everybody what this atlas is, and even possibly just a little bit of the work that you did as editor at large?
So, we're so accustomed to the grid map. Well, I remember when I went to Boston, when I first went to Boston to be there for a year, and a friend from New York sent me a meme in which it says, New York City. And then underneath there's a grid and it says, because we want you to get to where you're going. Then right alongside it, it said Boston. And you saw all the serpentine streets and the cul-de-sacs. And then right underneath that, it says, because F you. And what it was a New Yorker's way of talking about Boston, of saying, the map doesn't fit. It's not the way I've encountered things. And what actually happens is that this was admitting that maps are in many ways visual representations of how we see ourselves in space, of the kind of stories we tell about a place and the way in which we fit within it. And we become so accustomed to the grid map, in which it is about efficiency, the fastest way, the most efficient way to get between 2 points, that we had forgotten the older maps, the story maps, which was a story of ourselves on the landscape, a story of our interest. Sometimes you could tell like map sleuths could tell who had made various maps in the oldest story maps because of the different signatures. You could see someone's interest. You could see a map really in a lesser a representation of reality and more an extension of the imagination and how the imagination encounters reality. And so we wanted to return to that kind of map to say, we wanted the maps in which it wasn't merely about showing you how to get to a place, but it was a map that was very much about how to locate you in a place. Who are you in a place, rather than what does it mean to get from one to another. And we thought that these story maps could also double as a cultural history. They could double as political history. They could double as economic history. They could also, more than anything else, fundamentally double as and show in very vivid ways the ways in which maps truly are stories. And what does it mean to see ourselves in a place and to imagine our stories? What stories aren't being told by the kind of maps we're looking at now? By looking at Google Maps, for instance, and often you're saying, oh, here are the gas stations, here are the convenience stores, and here are the 3 or 4 or 5 things that we think that you'll be interested in as a tourist. But what does it mean in which we're all in some ways bullied into that story? And the grid is a bullying structure. If you think about being in New York and walking in New York City in the grid, and you suddenly stop and somebody goes, come on, out of my way already. The way in which it prizes movement, it prizes fluidity rather than the cul-de-sac, rather than stopping, the observing. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to gently push against the grid, push against this idea of quickly moving and not tolerating ambiguity, not tolerating the clots, that so often it's the clots that make a place interesting. The times in which we stop, the times in which we linger, in which we observe, in which we give ourselves over to a place and allow that place to inscribe itself on our imagination, and in turn, give that place our emotions, our affections, our questions, our curiosity. And what might it mean to then suddenly create maps that are telling stories, rich stories about a place, but inviting our curiosity? And then the best maps are incomplete. The best maps are maps not in which you've seen everything and it tells you everything about a place, but the best maps are the maps in which there are these spaces. And as I said earlier before, walking in mystery, there are these moments of mystery in which you're then asked to inscribe yourself in. That the best maps are the maps that need your encounter with it to complete it, for you to see yourself, within it, for you to see, other stories or can imagine other stories. And so we wanted a book that could have a collection of maps like this, that admitted that there are at least 8 million stories in New York City, in a story, per person in the population. And there are infinite amount of stories. And this was just in a few of them that weren't so much representative as much as suggestive, in as much as an invitation to say, if these are all the fascinating stories, that are there, and some of which you've missed, imagine the other stories that are there, come see, come look, come listen. But it was also a way of saying every city is like that. There's this tendency for New Yorkers, and I say it as one who had lived there for a long time and still in many ways consider myself a New Yorker more than anything else, but there's this parochialism. I remember we had done the book was the last in the trilogy. It was San Francisco, New Orleans, then New York City. And I think it was Tennessee Williams, who had made a comment that, there are three interesting cities in the US: San Francisco, New Orleans, and New York City. Everything else is Cleveland. That was his comment. And of course, my entire family lives in Cleveland, so I knew that Cleveland was an interesting place with this many interesting stories. And we wanted to, play with that code, but also to suggest that no, every place could produce at least a dozen of these books. And so it was also an invitation for other people to begin creating the maps in their places. And all the maps are a juxtaposition of sort. There is, we're taking one story and juxtaposing it with the next story, thinking that the juxtapositions are the more interesting stories that are happening. And so, for instance, we were looking at Flushing and juxtaposing the story of religious freedom and religious history and liberty, which was happening there, along with nurseries, these gardens and these places of repose, these places of relaxation for people. And you suddenly recognize how these two things that you think have no connection to each other, that in putting them in conversation with each other, just all the things that are revelatory. And so part of it was to make the maps more interesting, but part of it was to suggest that we were trying to get that encounter, that by continuing to prize juxtaposition, people were invited to suddenly ask, how does my story intersect with other stories? And what especially interesting stories come about when two stories meet. So that's part of what was happening with the book. And the book also had some political aims, as it were, to challenge narrow ways or impoverished ways of seeing. So for instance, you walk around public space and there is, you assume that women have done nothing, through the entire history of the world, that they've made no contribution to public life, they've made no contribution to, public space, because every single monument, just about every single street name is named from a man. And when women do appear in New York City on monuments, they're some abstraction. They're not a real name. They're peace, beauty, loyalty, something of that sort. And so we decided, why not try to address that asymmetrical, recognition in public space. And we took the New York City map, subway map, something that just about everyone knows. And we changed the name of every single subway, to the name, of a woman who had made a significant contribution to public life, who had lived in that neighborhood, or grew up and were shaped by that neighborhood. And one of the things we also did, that sometimes we would take names that you don't expect, unusual names. And so everybody would know, let's say, oh, we know that, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, grew up here, and we may put her somewhere else that was formative for her. And so as you looked at that subway map and you said, oh, I didn't know this person had lived here, but any of these 7 or 8 or 9 other people. Because what we were also saying is that for every name that you've seen there's a million more names that could have gone with this subway map. And so we at once invite you to start thinking of, filling in the names, to create your own maps, to create your own stories. But also we've found it a way to acknowledge just all the rich contributions that have been made by women to New York City and to the nation, who have been from New York City. And then also to then critique, what does it say that all these names, all these figures, all these stories are absent from our public spaces? What kind of stories are we therefore telling ourselves and telling each other by not having that recognition? And so the book, had all those aims. It was an invitation, it was, subversion, but more than anything else, it was a treasuring of story and a highlighting of story and a celebration of what happens when stories meet and bump into each other, encounter each other. And so the one that I did there was in which I wanted to look at immigration to ask, what does it mean to think of immigrant New York? And it had become so encrusted under mythology that, oh, it's a nation of, a city of immigrants, in a nation of immigrants. And it felt like a too simplistic way of seeing it, and not, trying to see, what about the character, the nature of immigrant New York made it interesting. And also to get away from this idea of, immigrant neighborhood is just a place to go and to get interesting food and music and fabric. and to say, what does it mean to actually see them? But also it was a time in which, just the time I was working on it, it was a time in which the status of the stranger in America was becoming something more contested, that the stranger was something to be feared, the stranger was something to be suspicious of, the stranger was something to keep at arm's length. And so what might it mean to write an essay that also celebrated the stranger, that again thought of the stranger as something to, someone to welcome, someone to, to see, the ways in which seeing ourselves through the eyes of a stranger can actually show us things about ourselves that, because we're so close to ourselves, we might have missed. And I wanted to then walk to have, that status in which I was a stranger, but yet still have some familiarity with the city and what the city might look like, through the eyes of, through, eyes that found the city, beguiling and yet frustrating, that found the city, mysterious yet inviting, that was someone who's familiar yet a stranger. And so it became a way also to celebrate, a stranger's point of view, not the tourist point of view, as much as a stranger's point of view. And even the tourist is someone that, coming to celebrate, who's, much maligned, but to say, what it might mean to have someone who keeps asking the questions of a place and see the things in the place, the beauty in the place that we've come to take for granted or come to overlook. And I decided, why not walk? And I was always walking, and every year I did this walk, I said, oh, I'm just going to walk for 24 hours straight around New York and see, what might it mean? What might it mean to go around the world in a day by just walking in a day? And as we were talking, I was trying to figure out how to do the immigrant essay. I made a joke to say, oh, I could just walk for 24 hours and it could be just like walking around the globe, thinking it was funny. And then Rebecca went and said, yes, that's it. You're going to walk around for 24 hours and let's write about that. And that's how that map and then that essay, became there. And then it was the ultimate juxtaposition of stories, of me encountering story after story after story. So if you even look in the book, there are photographs accompanying it with a photographer, Roddy Roy, and you see people dancing on the street, from an African wedding. We encountered that wedding reception at 4:00 in the morning. And it was also saying just how fascinating New York is at all hours of the day, that, actually crashed that reception at 4:00 in the morning. I said, oh, let's go. That the worst that will happen is that they'll kick us out. And they didn't. We end up having terrific Nigerian food and then heading out on the street with them and, taking photographs. And there you had it.
So I want to show everyone this map because I don't think that people really understand. You can describe the walk, but I'm going to share it really briefly, hopefully not too distracting.
The evidences of my insanity.
It is evidence of your insanity. And I think it's wonderful. It's a little hard to see depending on how large all of your screens are, but you can kind of, at the very least, see Garnette's red dots along the boroughs. And I'd love for you just to kind of talk about why this was the route that you took, and maybe just give us a little taste of the sort of range of worlds that you crossed.
Yes. So if you notice, you see that big O that's in the background. There's an O you're tracing, yes, and it begins also with that, that ode from Whitman, that song of the open road, where he goes, "Oh, public road," and he, Whitman is one of the marvelous walkers, and talks about this joys that we have had from taking to the open streets, and my route was supposed to closely approximate that O. And so I remember sitting down with Rebecca and Josh and mapping out the perfect oval. I was going to walk this oval and it was going to look gorgeous on the map. But part of the reason I walked, and part of the thing I think is wonderful about walking, is the possibilities of encounter. And therefore it meant serendipity, which means I continually kept departing from my route. I'd hear an interesting sound, or I'd be talking to someone and be caught up in an interesting conversation, and I was not going to stick to the route and then give up that conversation. I was going to follow them where they were going. I'd get the waft of an interesting smell at 2:00 in the morning and go, oh, I think there's a party going on, and we'd walk and see it. And what actually happened is that the oval became this jagged line up. I said, oh, I can just do it again. Don't worry. This is fun for me. And Rebecca thought, no, this is perfect because this says something about the ways in which walking takes up our predetermined routes and our pre-planned routes, the ways in which I was taken off those routes because I kept encountering different people, different communities, different stories. And in that, one part of the route I was in East Williamsburg, and I think that's where the story began, in which I was this wasn't then, this was about a year or two earlier, in which I'd gone to Williamsburg to meet a friend for food, and up came an Orthodox Jew saying it's a Jewish holiday, and can you well, he didn't even say that. He said, would you like to do a good deed? And I thought, this sounds intriguing. Yeah, of course. And he's follow me. And I went behind him, and he introduced a rabbi who took me up into a synagogue, and I was unplugging kettles, turning off lights, moving things. Then I left thinking that my job was done, and he said, oh, follow me. And then I went to his house, and again, turning off things in the laundromats. And then I left out of his house, and as I stepped out, there were 3 people outside of his door just standing in the hallway, and he goes, follow them. And then I went the floor below, and I went in and turned on the light. And then when I turned on the light, there were around 40 people just standing in the darkness. For half a second, it felt like I'd walked into a creepy X-Files episode. It was just suddenly this darkness, light flashes, and then there's like 40 people just staring at me. So I was waiting for someone to shout brains or something like that. But instead, people were just wonderfully kind and appreciative. And then I stepped out, and then to the next floor, and then I was off and late for dinner. But happy this time to tell the story of why I was late, rather than it being the MTA holding me up. But what happened was, as I began walking through these in a variety of neighborhoods, and again, it's neighborhoods that you think that you think that you understand, but in just moving at foot pace and observing and talking, and many times you have to approach someone that people would see observing and invite you into a conversation, invite you to a story. That you're walking past a house and you're hearing a song, so, oh, what song is that? And somebody would tell us, said, oh, we're having a little barbecue on, you want to come in and grab something? And say, oh, I'm on this walk all around. I said, oh, come in, you can take a second and come in. And I'd come in and I'd have a chat to them, and I'd be on my way, and then off back again to East Williamsburg, with quite a bit of Orthodox Jews, and talking to them about music and the musical taste and what is it that they were listening to, and next one who's an obsessive walker like me, and then a bunch of them telling me about going jogging in the morning, and they were all in their full garb in the summer, jogging across the Williamsburg Bridge. And then I'd head off to Greenpoint and meet a bunch of Italians who run a restaurant, and would start speaking. I recognized that there's a place I went to, southern Italy, and I'd met their cousins from southern Italy. It's just the odds of that happening. And then from there, and then I'm off into the Bronx, and then bump into Jamaicans. And actually, it was even funny because in New York, you can tell when you're going to a Jamaican neighborhood, not by the Jamaican accent, not by the smell of Jamaican food, not by the Jamaican flags, which is how everybody would think they would see. These are all there. But you're in a Jamaican neighborhood when you start seeing a preponderance of Clark shoes. Jamaicans love Clark shoes, so much so there are multiple songs, odes to Clarks. And so I was walking through, and it's like, is this neighborhood a Jamaican neighborhood? And I remember being with a photographer who had come with me. He walked with me for maybe around 16 of the 24 hours, which again, I said, why give up now? I was like, you've done 16 hours, you're almost there. And he goes, no, I'm done, good night. And, but I was walking, and I said to him, I said, I think this is a Jamaican neighborhood. And he goes, I think so too. And somebody else said, John, because in different parts of the route, people knew I was doing this, and they'd pop in to walk like 2 or an hour and a half and then be off. And they're like, this is not a Jamaican neighborhood. And I said, yeah, there are all these Clarks. And I started speaking to the person, and he goes, oh, yes, a Jamaican neighborhood. It wasn't, but Jamaicans have been moving here more and more, this part of the Bronx. And so it was just, all those ways in which a city would show itself with these different gestures or different symbols and different conversations. And so in that 24 hours, in a city that I'd lived in for so many years, and I'd been visiting for many years before I even moved there, it was, again, throwing up all manner of new discoveries. And so it became a way to discover, and I recognized, and matter of fact, you don't have to go to New York City to do that. You could just step outside your front door. So, I know the suburbs get beat up a lot. People said, oh, the suburbs, everything is the same. You just walk past and all these houses with all these garages. And I said, well, just open the garages. One garage is that person who's obsessed with locomotives and has been collecting train sets since forever. In the next garage is that person who is a hot rod obsessive. In the next garage is that person who is a Barbara Pym fan and has every single novel, every single biography, every single story and about Barbara Pym. And so once the garage doors start coming up and you encounter people, you're encountering different stories. So you just have to just give yourselves over to them. And so that's what actually had happened there. So even though it seemed that, oh, there are all these fascinating stories happening in New York City, and I bumped into Nigerian wedding reception at 4 o'clock in the morning and crashed it, and everybody just welcomed us, and we're especially happy that we were crashing their wedding and celebrating with them, and we're taking pictures and dancing and eating and then off on our ways. There are other places that may not have that nightlife, but every place has a bunch of irreducibly complex people with stories begging to be discovered.
So I want to show everyone really briefly a few more maps from the book, just because the map that we just showed, which was your walking, is significantly different from the others. And I think they sort of reflect that peeling, or the very sort of focused, narrow look at a single map with a single purpose. But they're beautiful. They're works of art in ways that I think are unexpected. So, I've got just a few here. This is, I think, public-private maps of childhood. There's a map of wildlife.
And again, each of these are juxtapositions. The public-private childhood became a way to talk about inequality. So you'd see these housing projects and then you'd see a preschool across the road that's like $40,000 a year, or in which they had children's parties in which you paid like $10,000 to go to the children's party. But if you wanted a velvet rope, this is like a velvet rope for 5-year-olds, then you'd pay twice that price. It was astonishing, and in some cases it's deeply obscene, just the levels of inequality. And so it was a way of looking at the different, what does it mean to have different childhoods growing up in the same city, in the same neighborhood? Yeah. And then the wildlife, what does it mean to think of New York as a place of nature, which people don't think, and then to juxtapose it with actually wiling, as they call it, the whole act of wiling and the performative space of that practice of, wiling.
And then we have Love and Rage.
That was maybe the most fun map to research, because we got all the complaint data from 311 in New York City, so all the complaints. And so we were going through with all the complaints about noise, the complaints, about couples fighting, and so you could see this is the nature of the different type of complaints. So it became also, at least for us, it didn't show as much of the map. We showed some of it, but it became a way to trace the grouch in New York. So to trace the romance, the romantic in New York, but to trace the grouch. And so you got a chance to see all the complaints and who were making the complaints. And it was, it was a funny map to research.
And then we have Burning Down and Rising Up, the Bronx in the 70s.
Yes, and that became a way also to look at the mythology, that the Bronx is always represented as in ruins. It's either burning or it had burned and it's on the way to renewal. And so that story of a place forever tied to ruins, we wanted to decouple it from ruins and to talk about the rich cultural contribution, but to also show some of this myth and to show, just when the Bronx was burning, where it was burning exactly. And so this idea of the whole Bronx in fire and in a huge place of ruins as a backdrop for some apocalyptic movie, we wanted to push away from that idea.
And I'll just show a few more. We have Water and Power, The Reach of the City. And Trash in the City, Dumping on Staten Island and Beyond.
And there's also a way to be sneaky with some of these maps. So some of these maps are making their statements very quietly. So if you look at the map there, we're looking at trash. And so one thing, it shows New York pretty much effectively exporting its trap to the rest of the country. And so what does it mean to think of New York as, the exporter of trash, and that New York is actually sending its trash to your backyard or to your neighborhood? But I think we also have to show some of the corruption. So you see some of the places in which these mob bosses accused of corruption with garbage in a collection were also living like a block or two from the people who they were accused of bribing. So we didn't say anything about the bribes and the accusations. We just put their homes right there and said, just look at where these people live. Just leaving that there, do with it what you want.
So one of the reasons I wanted to show them, other than the fact that I think they're absolutely beautiful, and they are, they're their own essay in, their own cartographic essay alongside the essays, is that I think it just so beautifully illustrates how if you pull one single thread, one tiny, layer, and kind of explode it over the city, that you have story after story after story. But that also reflects something that you said, which is, when you're walking, it inevitably, it's, you're looking for where sort of two stories meet. And I'd love to hear from you because, I know you well enough to know that when you're working on an essay, it's a long, long, long thought process. And I think it's because you're taking on such complex ideas, whether you're using walking as the avenue or not. But, I would love for you, talking to a group of writers, a range of writers, whether they're creative writers or narrative journalism or whatnot. When you think about writing the essay and you think about all the work that the Atlas does to sort of pull those threads or look at the intersection of those two stories that meet, how do you approach the essay early on when you're walking those 24 hours?
I think of writing as really a relationship of trust. So if I came on and I began speaking to you like Yoda, and if I said, I'm happy to be here, I am. Up is what? And just however Yoda speaks, that flipped in a syntax and grammar, I think would start seeing the participant numbers just going down, and it would just be me and you and two people too polite to leave, or just too fascinated by what's going on with this guy. Does he have aphasia, or is he drunk? But everybody would leave, but they're not really leaving because of my syntax. Because if Yoda comes and you're saying, okay, so our guest today is Yoda, he's taking a break out from filming the next Star Wars. And from a not so far galaxy, he's popping in and we're going to have a talk. People would stick around, and even if they're not Star Wars fans, they're at least say, well, let's hear what's going on, what he has to say. Yoda is taking up writing, let's hear his writing technique. And they would stay because they trust Yoda. This is the way he speaks. But so when people leave, they haven't left because of my grammar, they've left because they've lost trust. It's the same when we said, I've stopped reading it because it's repetitious. But, we take in repetition all the time and find it even a beautiful thing. So you listen to, the Beach Boys, God Only Knows, that song, God Only Knows What I'd Be Without You. The song ended with them saying that line around a dozen times, maybe more. God only knows what I'd be without you. And each repetition reinforces a particular mood, a sensibility. It's part of the style that makes us actually get drawn into that song and makes us even more caught up in emotions of it. Or if hip hop is your thing again with a repetition in which that song, nobody on the corner has swagger like us. And every time they repeat that T, I said, no one on the corner has swagger like us, it reinforces and helps build a whole architecture of mood. And so, we stick around in spite of that repetition. And we can choose just about in a million genres. We'll see it in visual art, but we'll see it in writing, and just all over. So we don't leave because because of repetition. We generally don't leave because of bad grammar. We don't leave because of syntax. those things are in a secondary, but we leave fundamentally because we've lost trust. So writing is an act of trust. It's a relationship of trust between the writer and the reader. You move from sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph, section to section because of trust. It's your trust in the reader that will allow you to then, continue. So when I walk, one of the things that I'm also doing is in thinking about my own curiosity, and also the ways in which my curiosity becomes a way of, dealing with trust, or bridging dealing with the questions of trust, of distrust, and thinking in so doing and looking at ways in which I can think about trust. What does it mean to see the world? What does it mean to understand? What does it mean to move by trust? Also then believing that once I begin writing and having the reader moves through in a content, an arc of trust, rather than saying, oh, it's organization. I mean, structure fundamentally is not organization as much as structure is a particular instantation of trust. Structure is an expression of trust. What gets you from one to the other. And so as I walk and I begin to do research, I begin to ask, what does the reader need to trust me? And not as a device or as a gimmick, but to say, what does the reader truly need? What does the reader truly need to understand? What does the reader need to reach? I like always go after four things. I always think of the four W's when I write my essays. When I'm fortunate, in that it'll be wisdom, warmth, wit, and whimsy. And as I'm walking, I'm forever looking at the things that might reveal these four, in the ways in which my curiosity can open up these four, but to also again walk recognizing that I'm the reader's representative. I'm there for the reader, and what might it mean to listen to stories that will invite trust, in a trust that will draw the reader's curiosity. And so as I begin writing, I start piecing together all these variety of experiences in my curiosity, and always navigating between two things. That there is two things I don't want the reader to say. I don't want the reader to go, what? Out of a state of confusion, like I don't get this. Or I don't want the reader to go, well, so what? I don't care. Like, tell me something new, or this doesn't interest me. So I'm always thinking, how can I use my curiosity to navigate between the what and so what, and then produce two results. One of two results. Just produce who knew, which means something that they're discovering, or oh, I never knew. So a way of seeing old things in new light, or a way of seeing something new. And the walk-in, as I keep going, I keep saying, I can just trust my curiosity, that the curiosity, and just keep absorbing my curiosity is what's important. Because that's the way it can be the reader's best representative. That's the way in which I write, I earn the trust of the reader, to know that I didn't go in with a predetermined idea that was going to fit people in, but I went into my curiosity and gave them a chance, to be seen. That I head in which my ear and my eye are the most important things. How do I see people? Acknowledge them, recognize them. How do I listen? Truly listen. How do people define themselves in the world? How do people tell stories of themselves in the world? And how do I ensure that I'm actually listening to that? And because I have this innate trust in people and people's stories, is that I think if I've truly listened and gone around listening, I've really done a job being the reader's representative. And so when I sit down, something will be there. There will be some story that that will come, because there's no boring people. Well, actually, there are boring people, but everybody has the capacity to be interesting if you listen properly, and to get past the boredom. And with most writers, you're often, when you meet people often take you on their front porch. That you have conversations, it's a front porch conversation. It's where they put out iced tea or lemonade. You're sitting down in comfortable chairs and you're looking at things passing by. And so, those conversations are nice, but I never ever want a front porch conversation. What I'm really after is the kitchen. That's where the real conversations are happening, where people, open up, in which there's an intimacy, there's a warmth, they're wise, they're, whimsical and witty. Those four things that I'm, after in the essays, I'm also after that in my encounters with people. And so I keep saying, what do I need to do in terms of listening to, in listening and being respectful, and humble in my encounter with people, to get them to take me from the front porch to the kitchen. And so a lot of my work in terms of reporting, in terms of observing, in terms of researching, is again, trying to find the kitchen, is this constant search for the kitchen. And then trusting that once I've gotten to the kitchen, then, I have the material with which to earn the reader's trust. And then that whole task, of treating the essay like a puzzle, in which, how do I organize the arc in emotionally, in terms of ideas, in terms of issues, how do I organize it to move along the arc, of trust, in which the reader is trusting me from one place to another, in which the reader is making that movement towards the kitchen and enjoying the kitchen conversation.
Thank you for that.
That doesn't sound too abstract.
No, it was wonderful. So I want to open it up for questions, and that could mean that you guys put questions in the chat, or that you just unmute yourself and jump in and ask. I can certainly ask lots more questions, but I want to make sure we have an opportunity to answer some of yours. No? Okay, I'm going to throw one question at you and let everybody...
Well, I'll jump in, Mag.
Oh, good. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, so a couple of our classes have really read Walking While Black. And so I know one interesting discussion that my class had that you kind of touched on was sort of like, you're talking about the way that a Black man such as yourself experiences things, but then you kind of make a comparison between how women might also have to be conscious of their surroundings. But we had some really interesting discussions in my class about how that's the same and also how that's different, how the man is perceived as the threat and the woman is threatened. And so I just thought it was interesting that you put that in the piece, and I wonder what your thinking was for putting that element into that particular piece.
Part of it was I wanted to, I'm continually, thinking about, what are ways in which, even in looking at the things that happen to us, we're always conscious that we're not alone in the world. That are, I put it this way. I remember, recently, what James Baldwin was saying, that his task, or he didn't see it as his task to explain people who are Black to people who are white. He's saying, oh, I'm not explaining Black people to white people. What I'm really after more than anything else is that I'm trying to explain the ways in which we all contain each other, how, we each carry in each other's experiences. And one of the things I wanted was to show the ways in which vulnerability, was a shared story, and the ways in which also people who, would say, I don't know, or there's this tendency of denial, and a lot of women especially know, in this scenario where you'll explain in a story of being vulnerable, and someone said, "You sure he wasn't joking?" Or maybe you misunderstood, or but he's a cool dude. I don't think. Yeah, I think you misunderstood. And so denial of that story, in a story, of vulnerability, a story of feeling in danger, a story of being dehumanized, or even worse, dehumanized by way of assault, harassment. And I wanted people to recognize their own story in my story, and to suddenly go, but I also wanted people to recognize the ways in which my coming to understand how to deal with vulnerability were things that I'd learned from people who are continually navigating that vulnerability, and even navigating it in ways that I would never experience. And so, for instance, as you said, Doug, always, being the victim of harassment. So I think, for example, I have a lot of women friends who've dealt with this, in which you're going to a meeting, for example, and the guy on the street catcalling you and, harassing you. You're too visible for all the wrong reasons. Well, then go in a meeting with you, in a 15 minutes after these kept calling you, you give an opinion, you repeat the opinion, 2 or 3 women at the same table will repeat in an opinion and reinforce that it came from you, nothing from that guy. And then a guy gives a weak sauce, impoverished version of that same opinion. And he goes, oh my gosh, that's brilliant, Garnette. Oh, you heard that? She goes, yeah, of course I heard it. I said it in a 20 minutes ago, 14 times in between the 20 minutes ago and now. And so you went from being hypervisible to invisible, and it's across space, but it also works across time. People who are hypervisible and harassed nonstop, and then you hit some arbitrary age, who knows, in your 40s, 50s, when somehow men have decided that you're no longer worthy of their attention, and then you become invisible. And so you move from being continually harassed for decades to having people like bump into you and hit you up the sidewalk like you're not there. And so Rebecca Stunt and I actually always joke, like she always she loves going to the woods and hiking, and I love night walking. And so there are ways in which I know I'm walking at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning alone, and I don't feel that vulnerability that just about all my women friends feel at that time, because of the kind of threats and dangers posed to them. And so Rebecca would say, I have no clue how you walk at night and do that night walking in cities. And I said, oh, I have no clue how you go out in the woods. I said, me as a black guy, the last thing I want is to be in the woods alone, up in those hills where you're at. And she said, me, the last thing I want is to be on that street at midnight. And so we sometimes, will joke, where there are different ways or different places in which we feel vulnerable. So one of the reasons I did that, Doug, was that I wanted first to show the ways in which that there were echoes of this vulnerability in different ways. That it was a way to admit that intersectionality is not merely in a political pose, but intersectionality is actually demanded of us. That it's demanded that we see the ways in which our experiences are contained in other people's experiences, but also the ways in which these vulnerabilities are spread the vectors are much broader than we think. And what might it mean to learn from others, or to be able in seeing these experiences in others in different contexts or different spheres, to have a more richer understanding of the experience. But it is also a way to sort of show that the relation, the ways in which a lot of women to feel safe in public space, they have to almost like grow big, as it were. And some people like grow big in different ways, like that gesture of like the face, that serious face, or the ways in which people put earphones in, but they're not really listening to music. There's different ways of, as it were, enlarging themselves in public space. Where if you're a black man, you try to find ways to like shrink in public space. There's like that joke, that statement from before, whistling Vivaldi, the guy who walks in whistling Vivaldi. Or I remember somebody saying, oh, I'd sing Barney songs, these kids songs, I'd feel safe. Or I'd sing, what's the name of that kids movie again, when I go, let it go, let it go, let it, like that Disney movie, everybody knows it, I've forgotten, but the main song is like let it go. And so
it's called Frozen.
Yes, that's it, I've forgotten. And so just these are different ways of, as it were, effectively like trying to be small in public space, to communicate safety or to communicate bravery, if you're a woman. And so I wanted to show the kind of inverse relationship to public space, that each had, and to also make it clear that yes, this is a story about walking while black, but even more fundamentally, it's a story about being vulnerable and being vulnerable in public space. And what does it mean when public space is no longer this open, free thing that encourages serendipity, but is one in which you're continually worried about being surveilled, and in which suddenly public space feels more like a panopticon, to use that whole image of the panopticon of forever, being watched and wondering to what end are you being watched. And so in other words, what does it mean in which your fear is calibrated to other people's, if you're black, your fear is calibrated to other people's fear of you. And then also it's a way to even move up that layer. You can also, I know what it means to be in public space, in which I calibrate my fear according to being streetwise, these different ways in which the city gives off in a danger. But what about this almost this quixotic but also frustrating practice of saying, how do I then begin to do the almost impossible practice of trying to calibrate my fear to other people's fear of me? I have to actually then start the kind of mind reading and said, what about me who I think is safe would make other people feel unsafe? So I have to start imagining the ways in which people would imagine you as dangerous. And so that's part of what the essay is also trying to do. I wasn't particularly successful with it, but I wanted people to come out and said, isn't there something frustrating or isn't there kind of failure on his part that it means at a certain point he will assume that somebody's thinking that somebody's crossing the street from him because he's black, when it really is that they're crossing the street because he's a man. So that's part of what I wanted to do, to show those gender dynamics and to show that there are ways in which sometimes I'm reading something as race when I actually should be reading it as something because of gender. And there's a frustrating thing of how race works is then it then begins to affect your ways of reading the city. So I was sort of walking to say, oh, look at this guy. He's reading the city, and he walks because it becomes a way to read and understand the city. But because of the nature of race relations and the nature of racism and the way racial prejudice works within perception, even his own perception at a certain point becomes suspect. That he can't exactly sometimes deal in it or read the city as well as he should because of the ways in which race, racism becomes a fog by which he then begins to perceive things. So in other words, there's sometimes a woman might be clutching her bag and crossing the street, not because I'm black, but because I'm a man. And so I wanted people attempt to think, maybe he got that one wrong sometimes, or maybe he didn't. But I wasn't as successful I should have made other different narrative moves to make that more clear. But that's one of the things I actually wanted to do also. So I was trying to do multiple things at the same time, to pack in at least 5 or 6 different things at the same time by doing that. But more than anything else, fundamentally, more than anything else, Doug, it was a way of just acknowledging vulnerabilities, acknowledging various people who feel vulnerable in public space, and just how fraught and how frustrating that is.
Yeah, well, it's that fog, and in so many ways you just don't know what to think, right? It's basic unsafety. I thought you did a beautiful job, and I really want to thank you for the essay, and we had a terrific conversation about it.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody else that would like to jump in with questions?
I think Karen Powell serious want to ask question. I can see the expressions on her face, and I can see questions running across her face every now and then. I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Yeah, Karen, we can't hear you.
Oh no, can you hear me now?
There we go.
Yeah.
Yes, now.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you so much for doing this. I am so transparent, even on Zoom.
Yes.
Thank you for doing this. I am actually in the Department of Sociology, and I'm so excited to be here because I have really been grappling with moving from the academic space of writing to writing for a public audience. And I've been slow stalking the writers at Denison as fangirling them for a minute, because I just think it's an amazing vehicle for, and perhaps in this moment, I can't think of another time that public writing would be more important than the moment that we're living in right now. So I was thinking out loud, as you can see. First, I was laughing about the Clarks because I'm Jamaican actually, and I was hearing the Clarks and Prefer song in my head when you were talking. But I was also thinking about that the illogical nature of racism, and how much many of us want to make logical this thing that's irrational. And so when you're talking about reading, guessing, and mind reading, I recognize that as a way many of us move through the world hoping to perform ourselves out of surveillance, perhaps, right? Or become as unthreatening as possible, and even wondering whether or not the bag clutching can be assigned to race or assigned to a gender, as though it was logical when in fact it is irrational, right? And that though the schema don't necessarily, the categories in our mind don't necessarily aren't mutually exclusive, that there's this even in our processing, this intersection of devaluing and gender devaluing and racial devaluing and class devaluing that occurs simultaneously in a way that's not logical. So that's what I was thinking. And I was thinking about the data we know about stress and race-related stress, and how that process of mind reading drives up one's cortisol level, right? And stymies one's creative processes in the moment that we walk to gain to divine our creativity, that those things are stymied in that very experience of mind reading is what I was thinking, and that was coming out of my eyes without intending to convey that. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share what I was thinking.
As you said that, it reminds me of one of the things that the essay was about, and it's something that I'll continue to explore, and I'm working on other essays with that, which is, in some ways, it's fundamentally an essay about breathing. When we hear the expression, "I can't breathe," which has been one of the the mantras we've heard now in the context of protest, that there's a tendency to link that to affixation, and it definitely shouldn't be taken away from affixation because of just the different horrid and painful moments in which people have been saying that, only to die at the hands of someone shortly after. But "I can't breathe," it can also be understood, more broadly as, what does it mean to step through one's door and then suddenly, feel constrained? I mean, literally, physically feel constrained because you feel stressed or you feel worried, you're wondering about how you're perceived. To suddenly say, "Oh, there's a bus I would want to catch, but I can't run. I dare not run because if I run, then I may be perceived to be a thief." Or I remember, early in the pandemic, when I was walking and I was talking to different neighbors, and I said, "You need to wear the mask. Why you don't have a mask?" And they were all black men, and they're like, "I am not wearing a mask. I'm a black guy in the city. There's no way I'm putting in a mask." And then eventually they got to, but for a while that there was that, that reluctance, because of the fear that they're going to be seen as criminals, and they waited until the masks were all pervasive and everybody was wearing masks. They're like, "Okay, now I can wear a mask, but I'm not going to start." They said, "Find frat kids who live a few blocks away. None of them are wearing masks, and it's okay for them to be irresponsible, but I'm not going to be responsible while they're irresponsible. When everybody is wearing masks, then I wear a mask. But for now, I'll be read as a criminal." Mm-hmm. And so this taught us, all of those ways in which it's not breathing, and in which "I can't breathe," is, is understood as, a way of being in the world, a way of feeling constrained, a way of feeling, anxious, the kind of anxieties that accompany it. So I think of this essay, it could almost be called "Breathing While Black." What does it mean to, to feel constrained, to not feel that you can breathe? What does it mean to, sometimes even just to sigh, and it's not to breathe normally. It's either a sigh or, tight chest, or the ways in which you feel anxious, when people are assuming that you're a source of fear, and then your fear subsides when their fear subsides. And so even the people encountering you, say it's, those who are vulnerable, but even those who sometimes make them vulnerable, somebody who assumes I'm a criminal because I'm black, at that moment when they're assuming that, they also can't really breathe. And so what does it mean for us to think about, the way we breathe and the way we breathe in public space as indicative of the kind of problems that we actually have, societal problems, but also the ways in which racism, as you said, Doug had also alluded to this in his comments, the way it distorts things. And so you think of something as simple as gestures. Here's this gesture that's, begins in worship, the hands up, and it's a way of surrender, it's a way of saying, "I give up, I submit," and it now has been transformed into a gesture of resistance, and a gesture of solidarity. Or the knee, the genuflection, which began again in ecclesiastical context, in which you'd kneel, in a way of worship, on one knee, or you'd knee in political context if you're before, a king, or in a court, of course, or kneel to court someone. But again, it's showing deference, honor, and then now it's turned into a symbol of resistance. And so it's showing the way even gestures that sometimes will have their origins in worship, or gestures that will have their origins in romance, gestures which will have a particular innocence to them, how even the very innocent gestures, the very innocent or simple things then get transformed, and they can become suddenly symbols of resistance or symbols of solidarity. But the context in which they need to be those symbols, the kind of things that they're a symbol against, show just the distorting and the there's no word for brutalizing nature of racism, that even sometimes our simple, gestures, have to be, recontextualized, to take on potent meaning because of what has happened.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate what you just said, and I'm going to say this and I'm going to stop talking, I promise. That what you've illuminated for me is that walking in a particular context can have a transformative meaning depending on the body of the walker. And the reason I'm relating to that is because during this shutdown, I have walking this neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood that I'm thought not to belong in. I'm actually one of the, we've been here longer than most families, but I am often aware of the fact that I'm in a neighborhood I'm thought not to belong. So during the pandemic, I've been walking the neighborhood for the first time in almost a decade, but walking it in a way that's deliberate, noticing the flowers, like deliberately being present, and it's almost like a form of resistance that I'm here and I'm walking, but I'm very conscious that for the last 3 months, it's been easier and easier. And even in the walking, I have recognized that I have transformed myself from outsider to insider in this space, in a space that I used to not walk comfortably in because I imagined that I am read in a particular way, depending on how I choose to dress to go walk, or when my children go outside to ride their bicycles. But I'm fascinated by the fact that where you are walking, that act of resistance, the meaning of that act, it might be transformed. So I'm wondering if you were walking in Cleveland, for example, would this journey manifest itself in the same way? Or walking here in Columbus, or where I live, I'm wondering if you've given thought to how this project, the essay that emerged would be different as a result of it. Because in a place like New York, I would walk in New York. I'm from Connecticut, so but walking in this space that I occupy is a different walking than walking in the Northeast.
Yes. One of the things I did in the essay, I tried to show, here's a way of walking in Kingston, Jamaica that was different from how it was in New Orleans. It was different from how it was in New York City. So I wanted to say that there, in each place, has a different way in which it, responds to you, and you will respond to it. While at the same time, they're still uncomfortable in a thread of continuity in terms of the way racism and race works its way out. But one of the things I also wanted to talk about is, because you're a sociologist, you said, right? So to think of like these three different sociological concepts. There's the idea of thick description, the way Clifford Garrett's discusses it in Interpretation of Cultures, where he said that there's like a wink, like with the eyebrows coming down, where a wink could just be like something is in your eye, where a wink could mean a way of connecting with somebody. And so he talks about the way in which context and the way you have to force to behave with a particular context can change the kind of meaning of something. So from what he calls thin to thick description. So I think of walking as a kind of thick description. So it's not merely just a foot in front of another. It becomes a way of talking about the ways in which you connect or disconnect. And remember that walking is also a memorial act. So in many ways, my work is preoccupied with memory. So I know, for example, we're thinking so much about memorials now, and what should we do with memorials? Should they stay up? Should we remove them? Should we have them stay in contextualize them? Are they in emblems of history? Are they myth? And so in all of that, one of the things we haven't spoken about enough is the ways in which, in some ways, they're not even memorial acts. Like the even more powerful memorial act is walking. That you have a sense of place by walking. That if you're new to a place, so for example, the New Yorker who made that joke and sent me that meme about New York versus Boston. When you just go to Boston, everything you just feel dislocated. But the more and more you walk through a neighborhood, is the more the neighborhood sounds, its sights, its smells, its particular humor. Each neighborhood have its own particular sense of humor. It's in a mayor, like every block will have that one person who's been there forever and can tell you what was there before, what was there before, what was there. So walking becomes a memorial act. It's a way of getting a sense of attachment to a place. And then also there's this, in a sociological theory, Robert Sampson, neighborhood effects, where it said, nothing marks you in your life as much as neighborhood. The thing that's most determinative is in a neighborhood, is neighborhood effects. So neighborhoods live in you as much as sometimes even more than you live in them. And so if you feel uncomfortable walking in them, it becomes a way of sort of withdrawing from the neighborhood. And in some ways, having this break. And so the ways in which the neighborhood lives in you is this fragmented, in sometimes impoverished way And so that has serious effects in any number of different things. And then of course with civic participation, the next in a theory called the third way, that in a third places, that first place is like the home, second place is like work, but these third places are the ones that allow us to have a sense of connection to others, a particular civic connection. And so if you feel uncomfortable in public space or uncomfortable walking, or walking becomes this thing in which you're continually having this pantomime that we all wear costume when we leave and head out in the world, the way in which we dress to the world in our costume, the way we represent ourselves. But what happens when your costume has to double as armor? That it's not merely a costume, but it's also an armor protecting you from the world. It means so often that you're disconnecting from public space. And so it actually creates less of a civic connection. And so, the kind of civic participation. So they discovered that what actually makes neighborhoods work, and communities work even more than anything else, is not all the tight friends who are together. It's the guy who you pass every Thursday morning with his three-legged dog, that you stop and you say, "Can I pet this dog?" And you pet the dog and you laugh. You don't know his name, but you just see him every Thursday. And you have some small exchanges about the weather, or about the dog, or about the park, but somehow these small yet meaningful connections are what give you a sense of connection to that neighborhood, to that culture. And so there are all these ways in which that fraught walking removes you from the neighborhood, removes you from participation, removes you from a sense of place. And in so many ways, makes you, the perpetual alien or the perpetual stranger. And that has, as you know, social, like any number of other, effects, in terms of everything from health outcomes to educational outcomes to economic outcomes. And so it affects, and shapes everyone in awful ways.
And I'm going to say, I don't live in a neighborhood. I live in a home. So I've not described where I live as a neighborhood. I live in my home is my neighborhood, not the actual physical space, which ties on to what you're talking about. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So we've definitely gone over time, but I want to be mindful if there's somebody who's on the edge of their seat and wants to ask another question.
I have one if no one else.
Dana, yeah.
Burning to ask. This ties on to the topic of vulnerability when you're walking, but also especially connecting to your essay. What about walking makes you feel comfort even in these perceptively unsafe spaces, or perceivably unsafe spaces?
I'm not sure if I've been searching for the origin of this quote for ages. It's one of those things that if you jump on the internet, you see everybody mentioning that she said it, or some version of it. But the poet Lucille Clifton, who I adore, said, apparently said, because they call you by that name, it doesn't mean that you have to answer to it. And the way I take those words, meaning that you don't have to be trapped by other people's definition of you. That your own self-definition is really important. Or put differently, we're more than the sum total of what happens to us. And in my walking, in spite of all the awful things that have happened and that keeps happening, the possibility, so this is a great thing about walking. And actually that's what in so many ways there are any number of books that talks about the relations between walking and writing. And there's a whole lot, but for me, which nobody has talked about, but what links me with both of them is possibility. And I think of walking as a set of possibilities, and there's this invitation to possibility. And it's the same thing with writing. As writing is this invitation to possibilities. And I guess that's maybe for me, among the most frustrating thing with walking and racism is the way in which it shuts down possibilities of discovery, possibilities of encounter, possibilities of escape, the ways in which I can't be lost in my own head, because if I'm not alert enough, it could be dangerous. And I think of to answer your question, to think of the way I keep moving through, to keep thinking, actually I'm here to think of the possibilities, that there are the obstacles, yes, but the possibilities that are there, the possibilities of discovery, the possibilities of beauty, the possibilities of understanding are too much and too compelling for me to have that affect me. But there's also this line in Ntozake Shange's book, Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo. There's a, I think that's the book. I'm almost sure. There's one of the protagonists, who kept making this remark. You got to make room for the fool in everybody, or it's some version of that. But that's how I remembered it, because I remembered the book a long time ago. And so part of what I also think as I'm walking through, and actually almost as a guiding principle, is you got to make room for the fool in everybody. And sometimes that fool is you. So there are ways in which I might have, walked and, Maggie, has crossed the street and I misread it as racism. And I go, maybe it's because, I'm a dude walking at 11:15 at night, alone on the street. And so I have to make room for the fool in everybody. And sometimes that fool has to be me. And so I keep walking because I keep thinking that, the possibilities are too much, too great, too beautiful, too multitudinous, and too wonderful to make the obstacles stop me, from, seizing them, and from, as it were, walking into them. And then also, again, I'm not the sum total of what has happened to me. And so, that victim, being a victim, won't be this permanent state, as much as, these different moments, that punctuate the state. And that state is a state of discovery, a state of curiosity, a state of forever wanting encounter and understanding how much more richer, I am, through that encounter, in a richer sense of myself, a richer sense of other people, a richer sense of place, a richer sense of history, a richer sense, of memory.
I was going to ask, if not comfort, like what the feeling you got from taking long walks was, that overrides that initial apprehensiveness that you might have. So thank you.
And I'm not sure if have you ever seen that movie Before Sunrise? It's a trilogy. Is that Before Sunrise, Before Sunset? It's Richard Linklater, right?
Oh, I haven't.
So in the first one is Before Sunset with Ethan Hawke, and he meets this woman and they're walking around Vienna, and he's smitten by her for meeting a trainer. They said that they'll just take a walk for one day in this new city and get to know each other. And they encountered this pair on a bridge. And on the bridge, they said, "Oh, do you speak English?" And the guy said, "Well, do you speak German for a change?" So that kind of humor where he's saying, "You're in my country, like, for once, try to adjust or to listen to or accommodate to us." And they said, "We're trying to do some interesting things, and what should we see? Where should we go?" And they started telling him this whole tale, about a play that's happening later that day, and there's a cow that thinks he's a dog, and so he goes fetching things, and so it's this. It almost seems like this wacky, crazy, in a strange story, and it moves on. It's almost like a footnote in the film. But I keep thinking, that's why I walk. I want to actually have the experience where I encounter those two people on the bridge who's telling me about this crazy play that they're in, who has this sardonic sense of humor, who don't think that they're there to cater me, but to actually challenge me to actually see beyond my own self and my own narrow expectations and interests. That's why I walk, that I might actually encounter those two people on the bridge. Or like the Samuel Jackson character in Pulp Fiction, where he says, "I'm giving up this gangster thing." And he says to John Travolta, and John Travolta says, "What are you going to do?" And he goes, "I'm going to walk the earth from place to place like Kane from Kung Fu." And then John Travolta said, "You know who walks? You know who does that? A bum." Because again, it's the idea that, walking makes you a social, reject. But I see it the way, Sam Jackson does, that it becomes a way to discover the world, to go from place to place, and then to partially answer in a Karen's question that each place has its treasures, each place has its beauties, each place has its mysteries. And so, to think of ourselves as embodied beings, and the way our body, works and functions in each place. Each place itself will invite us in a different way, will keep us at bay in different ways. But that's part of the beauty of being human, trying to understand ways in which we belong and can belong in spite of the various obstacles that the world erects in front of us.
I'm in a fashion history class right now, and we actually just read an article called "The Embodied Self," and it was about how, like, even the clothing we wear, what we put on our bodies impacts, like, how we move in public space. It's pretty interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I think we need to wrap up, but Garnette, my friend, thank you so much for the last 90 minutes. And I wish that we could talk for another 90 minutes. I'm sure we could. Yeah. but I actually want to ask everybody who is on to sort of turn on their mics or turn off their mute and just say thank you to Garnette on our way out for the evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for spending the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
I'm so happy to hear you talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Garnette, thank you very much for doing this. This is Jack Schuler.
Oh, thanks so much, Jack. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Take care. I enjoyed it. My class is also doing a walking exercise based on your essay, so we appreciate it.
Oh, I'd love to see it after or hear some of the exercises. That's beautiful to hear. Thank you.
Cool. Well, take care. Thank you.
Night,
Good
everybody.
night.
Thank you.